Now, there's no doubt Australia is in precarious circumstances with the crises in the Middle East. There are no major policy responses from the federal government, and this follows decades and decades of either the Conservatives or Labor of entire economic destruction of our manufacturing base and energy security. It's just we are no longer competitive. Dr Alan Moran is Principal of Regulation Economics. Alan, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Mike. Great to be here with you.
How bad is it?
Well, it's pretty bad if the war is prolonged, and it looks like it's going to be prolonged much more than President Trump suggested in the first instance. You know, we only ever had 30 days supply of petroleum products, which is pretty low by world standards. Most countries have got 60, 90 days. So that's going to be drained soon. But, you know, as you inferred in your opening, this is a crisis of our own making. We've been discouraging the search for gas and for oil. We've been permitting the closure of refineries for at least the last 15 years, probably longer, mainly under Labour, but the coalition wasn't much help itself when it was in power. You know, so basically we've created this ourselves. We ought to be immune from much of the major issues in terms of gas and oil. We've certainly got stacks and stacks of it if we were permitted to explore and to develop it, but we haven't done so. So we're now very much dependent on imports of oil and petroleum products. We are trying to avert a gas crisis by talking about redirecting gas from export markets to the domestic market, which, you know, may or may not be a good idea, but it would not be a necessary idea if, in fact, we hadn't prevented the development of gas in the first place. And, you know, the sorts of suggestions that are in place of saying a 20% requirement for domestic usage can become very expensive. For example, the Ichthys gas development off the coast of Western Australia, they built a pipeline to avoid Western Australia because they'd have had to have a 15% set aside for domestic use. And they built the pipeline to Darwin instead. Now, the cost of that, you can work out what the cost is because it's well known what the costs of undersea pipelines are. The cost of that is about $2.68 billion. In other words, they had elected to spend $2.68 billion to avoid landing gas in Western Australia, which would have required 15% of that gas to go to the Western Australian market. So, you know, that's a very expensive requirement if that sort of requirement is placed on us in certain circumstances. So, you know, if it was placed on us in the first instance, it may well have been that project, which is about a $40 billion project, would not have proceeded. So, you know, we having gotten ourselves into this pickle in terms of raising our costs through net zero, preventing coal being used and forcing it to be displaced by unreliable wind and solar, we have elected to increase our costs generally to manufacturing, which has closed down a lot of our manufacturing industries, and has left us in a precarious position in terms of fuel supply.
Yeah, it's as some would say, the chickens have come home to roost, haven't they? And then we see, we continue the bad policy we have at the moment. The renewables pushed by most of the governments in this country, and if we keep going down that path, besides destroying the environment, which they will, or destroying farmland. And I read somewhere where they can take up to 70%, which is just terrible. We haven't learnt from the past, and it seems even though we have this crisis at the moment, our government is still doing the old ostrich trick. Let's put our head in the sand. If you put your head in the sand long enough, you're not going to come up for air, are you?
Yeah, he's trying to paper over the cracks there of its own making. It's just named a fuel czar, an energy czar, who's a lady who's been very much involved in the government's renewable push in the past, and she's now the energy czar. I'm not quite sure what she's going to do, but you know, we've arrived at this position because of government policies, and those policies are continuing. You know, they certainly Labour's policies are continuing. Under Labour, the coalition may be changing, but it wasn't that much different from Labour until recently. Indeed, Angus Taylor was the industry minister, and he was featuring very much what he called an Australian way to get to net zero, which was, you know, carbon capture and storage and hydrogens and all that sort of stuff. You know, which has proved to be worthless. In fact, have a negative value. The Labour itself, of course, had this or has this future made in Australia policy, and that policy is basically subsidising renewable energy and hydrogen. Indeed, its first major project was a hydrogen hub, basically in New South Wales, and that hub has now collapsed. You know, there was a $400 million. This was going to be a future which was going to ensure we have reliable supplies, low cost supplies of what is the next big thing, allegedly, the hydrogen. No, it didn't work. I mean, and that's the pattern with all of these government interventions. Government always has populist good ideas, and they kind of throw a lot of our money at them. They never work, never ever work, and they're just wasted. Not only they're wasted, they distract entrepreneurial energies away from things that might work. It's time that we actually started disengaging from these kind of positive attempts to redirect the economy, which have actually only led to losses and falling living standards.
Yeah, it's a real worry, isn't it? I look at the farming industry or the farmers in, say, Victoria with the Compulsory Acquisition Act that Jacinta Allen rushed through without having the final report on the environment. It doesn't. I mean, if government continues to do what they're doing, and she is very enthusiastic, to say the least, to really bugger up the farms, and the property will decrease in value. It will destroy the communities. It will create a fire hazard. The list just goes on and on and on. But when you start walking into someone's business and taking away their right to run that business how they see fit, and if they do a good job, then great, and if they do a bad job, then they need help. But to walk in and say, we're acquiring your land, and your land is going to be used because we're going to plonk either, you know, wind turbines, or we're going to put in these great interconnected towers, which is transporting the renewable energy from other parts of Australia when it's windy. It doesn't augur well for farmers, and if you destroy that, if you take away the ability to decide on what to do with your land and your crop and the way you're growing or maintaining it, then all of a sudden we have, many would say, a communist society, and people on the land then won't be able to exist unless they do exactly what the government says. Don't see any money being handed out to them, except your bit of land is worth that amount. No, it's worth a lot more because you've got a great lump of metal between one side and the other side. What do we do about it? How do we get government back on track?
Well, for a start, I mean, we're building all these transmission lines, etc., simply because we need them for wind and solar. I mean, because it's a less dense form of energy, and it's more precarious, it's more intermittent than the coal that it's replacing. So you've got to have a lot more of these transmission lines, and farmers don't like them going through their land, and so they object to them, and then there's compulsory purchase. Farmers don't like being adjacent to wind farms and to solar farms, and they try to object. But as you said, Jacinta Allen is preventing those objections taking place. But there's an even bigger issue, and that is the farmers. Many farmers voluntarily are making their land available for solar farms and for wind farms. Why is this? Well, the reason is that they can obtain a lot of money, or they think they can obtain a lot of money, because the wind farms and the solar farms are so heavily subsidized that the promoters of those programs can afford to buy out the farmers and install them on the land. And therefore we've got a reduction in the amount of land available for, mainly for agriculture, for forestry as well, I guess, simply because there are these huge subsidies which make it far more profitable for a farmer, at least on the face of it, to actually give up the farming and actually give his land away or sell his land availability for wind turbines and for solar panels, which, as we know, basically give no value, in fact, give negative value to the economy as a whole. So for negative value for the economy as a whole, farmers are being presented with opportunities to earn far more money through redirecting their land from productive purposes to unproductive purposes. And this is compounded by the then requirement to actually install more and more of these transmission lines to obtain this low density, poor performing power to transmit it to major centres of usage.
Yeah, it's really quite concerning. I mean, a lot of the companies who Stephen Nowakowski was telling me the other day about 3 months ago, that a lot of these companies that are financing the wind turbines, they're designed, that particular company that manages the wind turbines are designed to close the doors 20 years after they've started. And the reason is that the wind turbine itself will most likely need to be probably replaced, and they can't do that. So what happens is it's the landholder that is responsible then for that turbine to get rid of the waste of that turbine. So what they have to do is remove these close to 300-foot towers. Actually, not 300. I think the meters, aren't they? 250 meters or something. Plus, with these whopping great blades, they've got to get rid of those. How do they do that? Where do they get the money from? So, and look at the solar farms. It's the landholder who's responsible for those solar panels. So, even though they say be careful, if it's too good to be true, it most likely is too good to be true. What do we do? How do we? And I understand, by the way, why those on the land accept these offerings, because it's a really tough life, and you think, well, my land is, it's got to produce, so at least I'm guaranteed of X amount coming in every year. To try and sell it would be near impossible, and the damage it does to the value of not only that particular lot of land, it's the neighbours. They also
exactly. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I mean, whether or not it would be a net value if, in fact, the farmer was recompensed, I don't know. But certainly, any farmer who's going into a project like that ought to make sure he's covered for the dismantling charges. And in fact, I think Premier Minns in New South Wales has said, well, if you're not, it's too bad. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of the sort of buyer beware thing, but you've got to make sure you've got a contract which doesn't leave you holding the baby when the other beneficiary has collapsed. So that sort of contract is essential. And Stephen Nowakowski is quite right that an awful lot of contracts have been signed, and that the farmer is going to be involved in the cleanup, which is going to be take a huge chunk, if not totally overwhelm the amount of profit that might have been made in terms of the rental charges he's receiving over the 15 or 20 years that the operation exists. But the big thing is that the only reason why it makes any sense whatsoever to give over your land to a wind farm and to a solar farm is because there's a massive subsidy to wind and solar, and that the people who are building these plants can afford to pay far more than the land is worth. And and that subsidy is created by government requirements, increased requirements in terms of the amount of wind and solar that must be incorporated into our energy supplies, and now with the newer projects in terms of just what they're buying, in terms of the government is contracting for 10, 15 years ahead with a certain price, which makes it irresistible for entrepreneurs to come in and say, "I'm going to build one of those, and we've got a guaranteed source of income." But that can only be made by government and offsetting the cost of that guarantee onto the consumer and onto the manufacturer, which of course leads to the decline in manufacturing, which we've seen all too readily in Australia.
Yeah, I have to say, it's a worry. You would think government, with food security, should always be a priority. At the moment, food security seems to be, way down at the list. And then we have the current fuel crises, which we do, and it is a crisis, and it will get worse. We see the panic buying, which I find very un-Australian. I mean, before COVID, we didn't really have these panic buying episodes. Maybe if your favourite beer was going to be not made, you'd go out and buy a few extra slabs just to get through the weekend. But we have many problems, and I don't know how to get around it. How do we get around these issues? One of people, or the way they think now, they've got to buy all the fuel. What do we have to do? How do we get around this? How do we start prioritising properly?
Well, long term, there's no problem. I mean, long term is dead easy. We just have to get the government out of the business. Essentially, we've got massive amount of just about everything we need in Australia in terms of raw materials and energy, etc. The only reason why we are facing this problem is because we've not been allowed people to develop it. And the clear answer is long term. Well, we will allow them to develop it. That basically we get rid of those regulations which prevent the search for and extraction of petroleum products, for example. How do we cope for this in the interim period? Well, I mean, the government's talking about rationing, and maybe they'll have to do that. I mean, usually the best form of rationing is the price, and I mean, rationing one way or another just represents the fact that there's a scarcity, however it's been created, and the best way of resolving that scarcity is to allow the demand and supply to operate and with an inevitable increase in prices. The other alternative is that you redirect it to the favoured areas, and I mean that creates a whole bureaucracy, and basically that bureaucracy is going to be favouring certain areas rather than others, and will not be doing so in an entirely economically rational way. But the long-term issue is easy. We just have to get, it's apparently easy, but governments don't see how to do it. But we just have to get governments out of the game and allow things to progress. Short-term, well, we have got an inevitable problem that we've got too little supply right now as we stand, and that's an upshot of 2 decades of a poor policy. How we handle that is a real problem. There's no clear solution. There's nothing but pain in doing so, unless, of course, this Middle Eastern friction, abates very quickly.
It's if we went back to common sense and decided to rebuild a few power stations and maintain them a little better and stuff, it still wouldn't do one thing for the crises at the moment. Now, can you might be able to illuminate this for me? It says that 20% of the fuel for the world goes through the Straits of Hormuz. Okay, why can't we then get that fuel from other parts of the world, or increase the supply from other parts of the world? So that even though there's 20% of the world supply, and the 80% is the rest of the world, at a time like this, an opportunity is there for the other suppliers of petroleum products around the world to actually increase their production, and therefore we still have 100% of production. We don't have the crises. We don't have the problem of fuel. We still might have a problem, though, with the fertiliser and other bits and pieces, but that could also be addressed. Why aren't we doing that?
Well, I think we will. We are. If you look in terms of share prices of businesses, oil firms and gas firms, which have got supplies other than in the Middle East or other than requiring to go through the Straits of Hormuz, those prices have gone up, and there'll be a massive incentive to increase supplies. You can't sort of just ramp it up to get rid of to actually fill that additional 20% overnight. Certainly, we will be seeing, and we are seeing, everybody outside of the Gulf area increasing their supplies, and that will help because the price has now gone up, and it's become much more remunerative to jack up your production levels. So that will help, and it also will encourage people to be searching for more oil and gas in places which are less insecure. So, you know, the problem does resolve itself in the end. I mean, there is no worldwide shortage of oil and gas. There's plenty of supplies available at a price. The price goes up, they'll be searched for elsewhere. But that's not going to cure the immediate problem, except in a minor way, because, you know, to bring in whole new prospects, you know, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. We're talking about years and years and years. Coal, of course, could come back readily, but to build a new coal generator in Australia would probably be 4 or 5 years before it came on stream, and it's even more for some additional petroleum supplies.
Yeah, I agree. Great conversation, by the way. Always enjoy these, and then I can keep talking, which I mustn't because I have other people I have to talk to. So stop me next time. Your latest published article is called "Australia's Precarious Circumstances." Where can they read that?
It's on my website. It's regulationeconomics.com. It's published originally in the Spectator, Australia Spectator. But most of my stuff is available on regulationeconomics.com to be just downloaded.
And any other way they can find out about the infamous Dr. Alan Moran?
Well, on that site itself, there is quite a lot of detail of not only publications, but who I am and the sorts of thoughts that I have, etc.
Yeah, Alan, always a pleasure. Enjoyed this very much. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mike.
It is the Country Telegraph.